you have to address the actual damage to the cell membrane. When you're dealing with this type of chronic infections and biotoxins, what it happens is that it causes a rift within the cell membrane. So basically damage.
Stress is the inflammation that robs us of life, energy, and happiness. Our typical solutions for gut health and hormone balance have let a lot of us down. We're over-medicated and underserved. At The Less Stressed Life, we're a community of health-savvy women exploring solutions outside of our traditional Western medicine toolbox and training to raise the bar and change our stories. Each week, our hope is that you leave our sessions inspired to learn, grow, and share these stories to raise the bar in your life and home. Today on The Less Stressed Life, I have a Dr. John Kim, and I'm going to read his longer bio in a moment, but on Instagram, his bio is root cause medicine expert, team anti-oat milk, so we'll get to that. And I love vegan Karens. I just enjoy that a little bit. So Dr. John Kim is a functional medicine pharmacist and a graduate of Rutgers University, and he pursued training through the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine. Driven by a personal health journey, he is dedicated to uncovering the root causes of chronic illnesses. Today, he owns and operates Robinson Wellness Pharmacy and his own wellness practice, Dr. Kim Wellness, in New Jersey. He also lectures nationally as an advocate for medical freedom, championing individuals' rights to make informed decisions about their healthcare. Welcome to the show, Dr. Kim.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be in your podcast.
Thank you. All right. So I follow you on Instagram. That's how this arrangement happened. That happens sometimes. And at the age of 33, 6 years ago, you had a heart attack. So tell us about that and how it changed the trajectory of your life.
Yeah, I mean, there's a one matter that a lot of people don't realize how some of the biotoxin issues can be a big impact on the cardiovascular function. And that could actually throw the entirety of the cellular inflammation that might be going through. And even though that we end up having to talk about functional medicine all the time, we really have a very minimal understanding of what kind of impact that biotoxin can actually cause. So long story short, when I was 33 years old, exactly June 4th of 2015, I have it as an anniversary marking for me. And I was having to deal with this particular heartburn, which I thought was a heartburn. Mm-hmm. And, I just got back from a wedding for my friend in LA, came back. I was a little tired, but nothing so much that I would just the time changing, plus the fact that I was partying all the time during the wedding. So I thought it was that was a biggest issue. And it turned out to be a heartburn, which I thought it was. Then having to have a sharp shooting pain down to my left arm. And long story short, instead of going to the ER like a fool, I ended up having to go to an urgent care center, and they did the EKG and they found out that I was just dealing with this particular angina and a heart attack. And they had to have the actual physician come in. They called the ambulance. I was brought into the ER. And even during that whole period, it was just a pain, nothing more. I didn't have any shortness of breath or sweating, just the common symptoms dealing with heart attack. I didn't have any. So when I got to the ER, even the cardiologist didn't even believe me, nor did the ER physician. And when they did the echocardiogram, they found out that my left ventricle wasn't pumping correctly. And so whatever diagnosis they thought it was going to be a pericarditis was dealing with something else. So I ended up having to put in a cath lab. They did end up putting a stent put in, and I had an 85% blockage in my lower anterior descending artery, which is called a widowmaker. And especially for young patient like myself at that point in time, you don't have any compensatory circulation that's been formed around the blockage, and you're more likely to die from an actual heart attack compared to an older person. So that was very surprising from the doctor's standpoint. Second is that my troponin level was less than 1, basically showing that there was minimal or actually no damage whatsoever. And the third was I was walking around with a heart issue for 2 days and having to come into the ER unscathed. So it was basically something that was a mystery from the doctor's standpoint. And then the second point that I also made was that because I didn't have any classical signs of a heart attack, they would have just sent me home with that issue and then told me to at least they were going to have me talk to my cardiologist and then screening it. So it's really a eye-opening moment in terms of just experiencing that. Secondly, experiencing God's provision and grace and having to experience it and having to change the overall trajectory into what I'm doing nowadays is completely different. So the conclusion was, why did this occur? Right. So I ended up having to come home after the stent putting in and having to sit in the ICU, in a cardiac ICU unit for 4 days, wondering what would happen. How could I have not seen this from the get-go? And even just staying home for 2 weeks just to recover after that was also mind-boggling as well, because I keep on having to stare at a wall and I'm like, what am I going to do? Do I need to quit my job and walk away? Is this something stress-related? So I'm very fortunate enough to have a lot of resources and a lot of the top functional medicine doctors around the area. And one of my physicians that I work with on a daily basis, she was questioning whether I was dealing with some kind of a vector-borne illness or some type of toxicity going on. So we got the blood draw done. And then after 4 weeks later, that's when I was tested positive for Bartonella, along with high levels of mold aspergillus antibodies, along with Epstein-Barr and parasites. So that was not a definitive diagnosis, but basically it was a hidden biotoxin issues, which led to having to deal with a preconceived heart condition. So that was it. And then it took me about 2 years to clear the Bartonella infection. It's already been almost 7 years. I'm Bartonella free, which is a lot of people are not able to achieve. Secondly, I have a better understanding in terms of cellular inflammation and what goes on really impacting people's lives, especially when you're dealing with biotoxins. And namely, you're going to be talking about mold toxicity, but that's something that I am an expert in and what I experience and what I teach patients and how to take care of themselves as such is something that's really been an eye-opening moment. And as was how certain little things like that end up having to change the trajectory and what I do to take care of my clients.
Yeah. Well, you're not the first one I've had a conversation with that had mystery heart attacks, because you're a young, healthy person. And I did have a functional cardiologist here at one time who also talked quite a bit about biotoxins being a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. That said, if you had all of these infections, biotoxins, and parasites, I'd love to know if you were ignoring other symptoms that you were dealing with long before these heart symptoms.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was working constantly. I had severe GI issues. I used to suffer from halitosis, so I had severe bad breath. And looking back, that's a sign of a mold toxicity going on, right? And that is something that I never ended up having to realize. I thought it was just the issue dealing with dysbiosis, much bigger than just dysbiosis. You have dysbiosis causing inflammation in the gut, leading into having lipoprotein saccharides being released into the lumen, into the blood vessels. And then you have a cycle of all these inflammatory cytokine activity, which can also cause the oxidation of the lipids, right? So in connection with cardiovascular issues, you have to talk about GI function, which is not talked about readily, right? When you have a leaky gut, it's not just about the GI problem. You also have to cause a systematic inflammation along with the cellular inflammation that goes on. And so you have a very leaky everything in terms of your cell membrane and along that line. So you have to address those things very carefully.
Well, I think we'll spend a bit of time talking about that because this is an area that hasn't been talked about as much as it needs to yet. And this is why a lot of people are on a lot of supplements, maybe, and don't see changes. One of the big reasons potentially. But to the point of you being a man, having all of these things, and then it kind of culminating into pretty severe symptom. I am coming kind of straight out of talking to some of my clients today. And in this particular group, there's a lot of people dealing with known mold issues, finding it in their homes. And long story short, a couple of the women were lamenting about their husbands not being on board with some of these things. And so before we dive into some of the science, I'd love for you to talk about how you feel about that. What is your advice to women dealing with that kind of dissonance at home when they know and can see that there's an issue?
And that's the biggest challenge that I have as well in consulting my clients. I sometimes actually have the husband sit down during the lab interpretation session and then really showing them how is actually impacting the wife. But also one thing that I really have to address, for some reason, I don't know what it is with guys. When the wife is saying that she's sick, they don't really believe it. But then when you end up having to mention that it can impact your kids, potential fertility issues and cognitive problem and all these things, then they're like, oh, okay, then we need to address it. I just I don't know where the disconnect comes in. And really upsetting when I'm getting on these calls and it's like, you won't believe your wife is sick. But then when you end up having to mention that your kid's going to be sick or sicker as it goes, and then your light bulb opening, I'm like, oh, we have to adjust that.
Yeah. I suppose it's because they live in the same household and the man doesn't see the same symptoms, right? And so they don't maybe think it's connected. I can only make guesses.
I know it's crazy. And I know I've had already, I think 3 clients where the wife is severely sick and then the husband wasn't believing it. So I asked them to have their husband get on a call and they're very defensive as well, which is also a problem. And that, it's not impacting me. So what's the point? So it's very selfish in terms of what the guys are doing. And as a guy, it's just very shameful in terms of where their overall mindset is.
But as a man, do you think that sometimes men stereotypically are not very good at self-awareness of symptoms?
Oh, they
just
suck
pointing
at it.
to your
Excuse my language. They
Yeah.
suck at it.
Okay.
Really.
Just check it in here.
Yeah, they really suck at that. And then another thing is that they don't take care of themselves. And what they end up having to realize at the end of it all is try to do a quick fix. At least females, or at least female clients I have, they're very mindful in terms of what's really happening. They're willing to put the work in. They're willing to work on their issues, including trauma, and then doing as much they can to adjust overall root cause issues. For guys, very hard to convey that. And then I've had one client, he was cutting corners on the diet, let's just say. And the wife emailed me saying that, oh, the husband is not, keep on having to eat gluten when you told him not to. So it's just,
I think I think people love to poke at each other.
I'm quite sure. But it's really sad. It's not like they're mentally making this stuff up. I mean, unless you're a hypochondriac, it's a different discussion, but it's just like when you are noticing that your wife is going to different doctors and having to deal with these chronic issues all the time, having severe reactions to certain chemicals in the house and such, there's something going on. They're making this stuff up.
Mm-hmm.
And, if they have monetary issues or money issues and budget wise, I get it. There are ways to take care of that as well. There are financing available to take care of it.
Mm-hmm.
But the first thing is your spouse has to be well in order for the house to be well. Right? There's a whole lot of discussion that has to be done, but I don't know what guys really crazy.
Yeah. I mean, and I see a lot of kids and women. And so maybe the body structure is smaller. I think women may be genetically more predisposed to some of this, but with kids, especially, you see a lot of skin issues. And to your point about cellular damage, and you're talking about gut health needs to be in good shape for cardiovascular health, for inflammation of the cell. I see this with skin stuff all the time, that the phospholipid membrane is compromised because of inflammation. And then, of course, nutrients aren't getting in and out of the cell. And then you see dry skin, but you also see a lot of other things. I always say it breaks everything, right? Like these biotoxins, some of these more intense toxins can kind of break everything. Let's talk about the signs and symptoms of a really very simply yep, I found all my answers on testing, but I want to make sure we come back to that later after we talk about some cell membrane things.
I mean, symptoms deal with cellular inflammation could be many, but one of the things that could be very common is gut and as well as cognitive function. If you constantly deal with brain fog, right? There's major cellular inflammation going there, but also neuroinflammation. And if you actually run a red blood cell fatty acid analysis, for instance, through Kennedy-Krieger, you can actually check how much of an inflammation is actually really happening within the actual cell membrane, as well as the deficiency of this different types of fatty acid breakdown, especially lacking plasminogen. True discussion, and you could test for those and mark that out. So when you talk about Dr. Robert Navier, for instance, talked about cell danger response and talked about the metabolomics, say that word sometimes, but in dealing with, that's all epigenetic issues. That's actually from the biotoxins to the environmental toxins in dealing with genetic. And then you're dealing with nutritional micronutrient deficiencies to dealing with nervous system that's completely fired up and completely shot sometimes. And then now you have a GI issue. If you're already having a GI problem, that's just the first sign. And then now you end up having to see everything being dispersed from skin issues to having to deal with chronic allergies or histamine response, or I call it the mast cell activation issues, brain fog, right? Had trouble recalling certain things around. Maybe you may have a sensitive to sun issue as well. If you have a mold issue, for instance, you might be sensitive to the sun. So I call it the vampire syndrome, right? As well as chronic fungal infections around the body. If you have toe infections with fungal issues, it's a systemic infection that's already going on. Now it's actually manifesting on your skin itself. A mental health problem as well, depression. I mentioned about brain fog, headache issues, vertigo, pain issues, neuropathy, could be insomnia, tremors, kidney infections, chronic UTI problem, irritable bladder, very common with women and men. If guys are dealing with chronic prostatitis issues, that's just some form of mold toxins getting involved, especially aflatoxin. That could be a problem. Chronic viral infections, we have herpes infection that's actually happening chronically, right? You can't control over medication. Then there's some
suppressed immune system.
Yeah, that's something. Also, in a worse scenario, it could be susceptible to cancer, lower immune response. You could run functional labs. You could look at CBC along with liver panels to really see what kind of impact that they're already dealing with, right? When you have an elevated ALT, that's a sign of a chronic inflammation, as with dealing with some type of toxin issues, right? It's not just about the elevated liver. Why is it happening?
Yeah.
Okay. Instead of just watching and see and then wondering what's happening.
Yeah.
So these are things that could be impacting as well. Infertility is a big one, especially for women these days and guys. And then I think there's one point that guys end up having to have trouble understanding is erectile dysfunction. But the reason why the microvasculature of your penile tissue is not able to perfuse correctly, well, you have inflammation going on.
I also think hypersensitivity to things when there's all this cellular damage happening, because if there's cellular damage happening, you're not, to your point, getting nutrients broken down, getting them into the cell. And then if that's not happening, how does any other process work? Drainage and detoxification certainly doesn't work at all, right? It's way behind. And then you have these big infections coming in. So you tend to feel hypersensitive, just kind of crappy, overreacting to things, supplements, overreacting to foods, all of these things. I think that is a huge one. You were talking about nervous system. I'm just kind of describing it maybe a little different way. I feel like it's all kind of in the same overall bucket.
All the same boat. When you are dealing with mass activation and some of these patients that we see, they are super sensitive, you have to take it very slowly. I do this particular analogy called wrapped up a ball of string or even a rubber band. You can't take everything apart all at once. You have to do it very slowly. It's like peeling an onion, for instance. So that it takes a lot of patience. It takes a lot of trial. And then you have to have the right functional labs to see what's really happening and then really triaging the issue. And that's the most important part. And one of the things that I always end up having to work with clients is that they have to work in their foundational care in terms of how they're sleeping, how they're eating, right? What kind of water they're drinking? Are they pooping daily? We had clients who are not able to poop for 2 weeks, 3 weeks sometimes, right? So you have to address that. Are they sweating properly? Are they able to exercise? Are they able to go outside and walk around? How is their family life? Do you have enough support going on? Do you have chronic stress dealing with from work? Is there family issues? You have an abusive relationship, right? These are things that could be minimal, you might be believing, but it's not. It's actually impacting heavy within the cellular inflammation as well, including support system with family members, spiritual health, all that encompassing that I end up having to put as a 10-point of foundational care that we really work on, focusing on that for the first 6 to 8 weeks while we're actually working on the drainage pathway and then detoxing properly. And then we're going to be having to work on some of the colonizing issues. And then we have to really triage what are the issues that we're seeing. Is it mass-like issues? Is it dealing with pain problem, including brain fog that needs to be addressed? And then you have to also look at the GI function as well.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about the cellular inflammation. And I liken this to being kind of like a dried up soil where the seeds can't get inside, not like a nice moist soil where the seeds can get inside. And so I tend to focus on phospholipid membrane support when I'm picking up that this is a bit of an issue. When you're looking at cellular inflammation, I know you're working on gut, opening up drainage, detox pathways, but is there anything you're doing specifically to aid in nourishing the cell to get nutrients inside?
You have to address the actual damage to the cell membrane. When you deal with this type of chronic infections and biotoxins, what happens is that it causes a rift within the cell membrane. It's basically damage. So you have to address in terms of why it actually is happening. Well, you have a phospholipid deficiency that's going on, and as well as not just phospholipid, you're also dealing with fatty acid deficiency. So when you're lacking in omega-6 and omega-3 and proper balance of that, which can also cause leaky cell membrane, as well as when you are dealing with chronic stress response going on, well, your phospholipid reserve is going to be less and less as well.
Yeah.
And third, if your diet is horrible, let's just say you're a vegan and having to have lacking in the overall intake that you really need from animal fat, including, then you're going to be having some issues as well. So it's all about the encompassing all aspect of what's really happening within that aspect. And when you are dealing with some of these symptoms that I just mentioned before, especially brain fog, you have major neuroinflammation going in the cell membrane that's been heavily damaged, that we have to fortify you with oral phospholipids, especially liposomal phospholipids. And I recommend a brand called Body Bio, which actually does the first thing that I took after my heart attack. Long story short, I had gotten the Kennedy-Krieger testing. We sent the lab results to Body Bio, and the founder, Patricia Kane, ended up having to analyze my blood work. Then she ended up having to give me the overall breakdown in terms of how much of a phospholipid I need to take on a daily basis and all that. So I know she retired, but bless her, that was one of the key components that really helped out in terms of getting my cellular inflammation down. And then I also did IV phospholipids. So that's another thing that I did, which is very hard to come by these days. Yeah. But that's what I did to reverse my issues.
Yeah, that's really cool that was sent over to her and that she was able to provide insight for your case. I use their phospholipids all the time. And I also think that they're totally life-changing, but I don't think that this is super common or talked about as much as it could be. So.
No, it's not. And it's a sad part that a lot of clinicians and practitioners are not looking at the cell membrane, right? And this is the same point that I always end up having to make. We're doing way too much, right? Throwing all random supplements, because we went to some didactic lecture saying that any clinician that's going to be on stage will say, hey, these things work. Or if you end up having to go to a supplement company seminar, of course they're going to say it's going to work, right? So that's when you end up having to pick up new tools and tricks and try to use it on your clients. But really have to understand, is it the correct timing of adding those supplements in? And is it going to really push the needle in terms of what we're trying to achieve?
Yeah.
This is the point that I mentioned about, I'll give you a perfect example, is use of glutathione. Everybody's trying to throw glutathione right from the start. I get that. It's one of the powerful antioxidants that we have to utilize. And that when you deal with chronic infections and toxins, the glutathione levels can be low. But there's a reason why glutathione levels low. If you understand the entire cell danger response and how that comes into play, there's a reason why the body shuts down the entire methylation process, as well as glutathione production, because they want less oxidative stress going on, as well as methylation process can be hijacked by pathogens to create more inflammation in the body, which we keep on having to not understand. So giving methylated B vitamins or glutathione, for instance, because we want to support the methylation right after that, wrong process to use. And this is the reason why a lot of clinicians end up getting into trouble. And some of the clients end up having to be not following the protocol, and they've having to complain that, oh, I'm getting sicker and sicker. And then the doctor's like, no, you need to keep on having to take that's the die-off reaction. There's a reason why there's a die-off reaction going on. There's a reason why the patient's very symptomatic, even with the protocol, and we're getting worse. We need to stop. We need to really assess the issues, understand the entire pathophysiology and what's really happening, and then address the cell danger response. That is adding in the proper phospholipid therapy and addressing the cell membrane inflammation, or allow the cell membranes to work well. Because what happens during the cell danger response is that mitochondria pumps out phosphatidylcholine to lock the entire cell membrane down to prevent other things to go out or go in. That is a particular defense mechanism the mitochondria is doing. What are you doing adding all these vitamins? And those are not going to be addressed when you have a leak or a damaged cell membrane to begin with. You're not achieving anything. You're just causing more damage.
Yeah.
And this is a particular thing that I wish the clinicians and have to understand. And I think more and more information of this should be shared.
Yeah. When I have this conversation with clients and I describe the dried up soil analogy, I say, maybe in 10 years, this will be really common. But right now, this is our conversation. I know you haven't heard this somewhere else, but this is what we're talking about. Okay, phospholipid cell membrane structure. I was going to say you called it vegan. I would also say like overall under eating. One really big sore spot. My shtick is, hey, let's fix your food reactions without being unnecessarily restrictive. Under eating and poor digestion in general leads to a lot of downstream negative, poorly nourished impacts, low nutrient status as well, which is just an emphasis on your point of, hey, if you're not eating these where we would get these phospholipids somewhat in animal proteins, then you're kind of missing out big picture as well. So under eating is one of these big pieces, I think, that goes along with that. And to your point, we talk about all these foundational things. You're right. If we're not looking at sleep, if we're not looking at diet first, but under eating is such an issue because people are afraid to consume foods because in functional medicine, there's been this huge focus on restricting foods for too long, unfortunately. And to bring this up because some phospholipid sourcing is from soy and people are like, oh, I can't have this soy.
Yeah, you're definitely correct in the malnourishing portion and they're not eating much. And another thing is the heavy emphasis on fasting. There's proper ways of fasting. Fasting can be very impactful, right? For especially if you're dealing with gut inflammation, you can do quick 3-day fasting and inflammation goes down, patients feel better. But is it the right time to adding it?
Yeah, then they just keep doing it.
Right. And that's not, even including, I'm not bashing Prolon. I do Prolon as well for myself once a year. But is it a proper timing in adding Prolon, fast mimicking diet into the mix?
Right.
You may not be able to tolerate it, especially when you're looking at the breakdown of the ingredients that's adding in, having to found those 64 key ingredients for longevity process. That's a great information to share. But is it working well for these type of chronic infection issues?
Not for my clients. It's not the right choice for my clients. But sometimes I get people who are coming away from fasting protocols because they realize that there's still issues. The negative positive to fasting is that when you're reacting to a lot of things, or if you have biotoxins, you take out a bunch of foods that feed the biotoxins or might even have biotoxins in them. And guess what? You feel better. But that becomes a problem when you take that out and then you just keep taking it out. And I just mentioned that because it's part of the whole big picture of cellular inflammation and getting these nutrients into the cell. And if you don't have nourished cells, game over. It doesn't really matter. Like everything else is going to break down piece by piece. Yep. Speaking of nutrients, let's talk about why you hate oat milk.
This was a third time having to be on a podcast, and then the host was asking about why not oat milk.
Hey, I don't love oat milk. It's fine.
I didn't realize the impact of what oat milk can do for the body. When you talk about, I'm not going to mention any brand names of the particular ones that are in the market, but if you look at the actual ingredient on the carton or the box itself, first you're going to see water and then oats, but then following that, what's happening right now? They're actually adding in canola oil and other inflammatory seed oils into the mixture. Why? Because you're replacing an actual animal-based milk product, and to allow that overall satisfaction of ingesting fat, and especially to take care of the taste buds and the feeling of eating fat, they're adding in canola and other inflammatory oils. I don't care. And then there are cleaner brands. One clean blend I could mention is Malk, M-A-L-K. But you still deal with oat. And oat in itself, it contains phytic acid. It can actually affect the nutrients being absorbed. Secondly, oats are, depending on how it's processed, is perfect environment for mycotoxins to be involved. And even they say it could be gluten-free, but you're still dealing with residues of gluten itself. So it's not a full 100% gluten-free. And then you're dealing with blood sugar, because if you break down oat, it turns into maltose, which is basically sugar water, right? And you're ingesting that. Now you have a spiked sugar level that's going on, right? If you actually have very much of metabolic flexibility and you can control your blood sugar, great. But do we see that naturally in a patient who deals with chronic issues? definitely
No.
not. They're actually dealing with
That's a distant level of health. How many direct messages do you have to field every week about oat milk? Just curious.
not much anymore. I sometimes end up having to delete or just completely ignore it. I do get a lot of the DMs about, I'm dealing with autoimmune issues. Can you list me all the supplements I need to take? I'm like, no,
No.
I don't even know who you are.
Right. Yeah. No, there could be a different conversation for a different day. Funny life stories you get in Instagram messages every once in a while. I'm like, I don't know how to unsee that. But back to oat milk. In the defense of the listener, while we're here hating on oat milk, I once upon a time used to drink a lot of oat milk and I'll eat a lot of oatmeal, and I felt like it.
Oh, yeah, no, I did.
And part of that was probably a little bit blood sugar related. Like I think some blood sugar and mold history there, right? So as you said, oats are just grains are just a tricky harbor of mold sometimes. I'm way more interested in environmental sources of mold than I am food sources of mold, to be honest. But when you have a colony inside of you and you're eating a bunch of moldy foods, sometimes it doesn't feel good, right?
Definitely not. And I see clients I had one client, he was like, I went to a family event and they were serving pizza and then some snacks and all that line. And then, oh my God, I feel so horrible the following day. I'm like, yeah, that's the reason why I told you not to eat it.
Well, and with dairy also, I think I cannot guarantee everyone will tolerate dairy perfectly, but I think that most people can tolerate dairy a lot better than we do, because once you deal with infections and dysbiosis and things like that, we tend to tolerate things better, at least in some cases.
Yeah, definitely. That's going to come back, right? But the biggest thing that we have to also realize is what's really happening within the gut and why you're having reactions to such. You're really, what I see patients with, especially when they do their stool analysis, and I utilize GutSumo for Vibrant Wellness, the biggest thing that pops up all the time is having fat in the stool, or they actually lacking in phospholipids. What's really happening there? Well, they're actually lacking in stomach acid. They're also low in lipase, right? So these are the two common
liver gallbladder
issues.
Function.
Liver gallbladder function as well. So end up having to add in ox bile that I end up having to add in, especially pancreatin. There's another one. Also, so I also utilize TUDCA for Body Bio. One of the key things I end up having to add in to allow patients to ingest that fat properly. What's the whole point of me giving you a high dose of Body Bio PC when you're not even able to tolerate that? And then I had a client, he just started seeing me, and one of the things that he was mentioning about is like, well, I'm just having all these foul smelling poop now after eating all these things. I was like, well, you have an issue dealing with stomach acid and all the other enzymes are lacking. So we're going to add those in as well. So those are key things. Like we keep on having to push supplements. If the overall gut environment is not ready to absorb these things, it's not going to work.
Yeah. Going back to the beginning of your story, well, the story was concise enough. It sounds like you were very lucky, in my opinion. It sounds like someone did some testing and it actually found things that you were looking for. I would say I hang out in mild to moderate mold space, and I like it there. That's fine. I pick up mold that other people are not going to pick up. But my point is that if your test came back significant, you got a little bit lucky, because sometimes it doesn't always look significant, or people are told that they don't really have much of a problem, depending on how testing is done, different types of testing, et cetera. So what do you want to say about testing pros and cons? It's imperfect, but you got pretty lucky, I feel like.
Yeah, it's all God's grace, and not boasting about it. But one thing is, being that I'm in a medical profession, owning a compounding pharmacy, having to work with some of the top functional medicine doctors around the tri-state area, it just gave me a lot more exposure and knowledge, and asking the right questions. It was the biggest impact that I made in dealing with the issue that I found back in 2015. And that was a reason why the correct testing was also utilized as well, especially if I decide to just do random blood tests using other lab companies. Detection of Bartonella is going to be nothing, right? There's not, but we were able to utilize IGeneX using fish testing that was able to detect the Bartonella infection I already had. I don't particularly believe at that point in time the urine mycotoxin testing was actually prevalent, but we were able to utilize the antibody. And we found out that there was heavy levels of Aspergillus antibodies floating around. Then we were able to say, hey, we are seeing some type of mold issue that's going on.
Yeah.
And third, Epstein-Barr and then parasitic issues. And there are no perfect parasite testing available, except for that one company called parasitetesting.org, where you could do a blood spot testing to see the type of parasites you're dealing with. But during that time, you have to look at some of the lab markers. And that's the thing. A lot of functional providers are lacking in knowledge into meeting functional labs. I have one client that she went through several doctors, and I noticed that there were certain lab markers, especially her low ferritin level and high levels of eosinophils. And you're dealing with a parasite issues.
Yeah, at least.
How is it that
if not more?
She went to 5 different functional MDs and completely missed it. I'm not trying to bash on it. It's just like, is lacking in the overall knowledge and not questioning why certain lab markers are elevated or low.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem. That's the reason why patients aren't able to get the right answer they're looking for. And that's the reason why I'm so fortunate. And by God's grace that I was able to find the answers right away. And the treatment started within 2 months after having a heart attack.
I want to emphasize that you said the urine mycotoxin was not positive, but the antibodies in your serum or in your blood was.
No, so let me correct that. It was not popular.
Oh, okay.
Utilizing it. I think that was available at that point in 2015. Okay. And so we were using blood to check it. Mm-hmm. And even Dr. Schumacher, who's very forefront in terms of dealing with mold toxicity. And you have to look at some of the other lab markers as well, especially VEGF and all those things. But again, the training, the overall knowledge, the access to some of the inflammations, especially getting connected with body bio at that point in time, able to find the co-infections that we're dealing with, clearing it out, and having to have that overall, I call it the cellular resiliency, right? That was able to build up and have to get my life back, including all the key things I've noticed after dealing with all that. Not having to deal with food allergies. My gut's clean.
Of course.
Right? My skin completely cleared up. I used to deal with cystic acne everywhere. So those are the biggest issue that was already taken care of, just fixing the gut and the phospholipid issues.
Mm-hmm. Since you have a compounding pharmacy, what are some of the most common things that you are compounding in your pharmacy that patients aren't able to get in other places?
Low dose naltrexone.
Interesting.
Low dose naltrexone is one of the key thing that's been really impacting thousands of patients these days. You may not be able to go to the most complex, well-trained functional MD, but if you could get a source of low dose naltrexone and find the key dose for you, you could reverse a lot of issues dealing with, especially.
I didn't realize that was so hard to get.
It's not hard to get. It's the right doctors that are trained to prescribing low dose naltrexone.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody has to understand that the low dose naltrexone dosing has to be around like 4 to 4.5 milligrams. Mm-hmm. That's not true at all. And having to understand that we have to give these clients this naltrexone in the evening is also false as well. Mm-hmm. There's a group called LDN Trust where they do have, it's a nonprofit organization. They pull all the studies, data, and as well as practitioners together to really dive in the science of naltrexone. And more every year, we're learning new things, new tricks, right? So even for us, when we're compounding low dose naltrexone, we always thought giving capsules. No, we don't. We also give it 2 liquid drops, or we give 2 patients troches where you could do a melt away of low dose naltrexone. You could even do nasal sprays to reverse some of the issues patients dealing with, chronic neuroinflammation, as well as dealing with anosmia after post-COVID issues. So those are a couple of ways that we could do. The thing is, unless we actually have all these experiences that we could share with other practitioners, well, that LDN Trust does it very well for getting all those practitioners together and share that information.
Yeah, that's cool. Is there any other ones?
I compound a lot of prescription-based anti-parasite medications. Right?
Oh, interesting.
Instead of just relying on a herbal-based antiparasites, you could really hyper-focus on the type of the parasites you're dealing with, and then you could really make a short treatment of the parasites and then really help get clients, push that dial needle that they're looking for. Mm-hmm. The third thing we do a lot is bioidentical hormone replacement therapy.
I was wondering that. Going back to your story for one more thing, you had all this testing done after your cardiac event, and you did say that they had found parasites, but we know that parasite testing is not very good. Was it actually other secondary markers in blood that were giving you indication of parasites, or How did you know for sure? And did you trust this? Like, I don't know how much you were into functional medicine, or if there was a little bit of a bridge, or if someone kind of introduced you to some, or if you were already open to it before you had this cardiac event.
Yeah. So I was always into functional medicine. So when I graduated from pharmacy school back in 2006,
Mhm.
and right before I was graduating, I didn't feel that the actual pharmacy work that I was learning about and doing was the right way to do it. Because I saw this particular one client that was working in the ER as a ER pharmacist. She ended up having to come in every single week. I was there for 5 weeks, every single week with uncontrolled blood pressure. And even optimizing, we thought it was optimizing actual medication, didn't
Yeah.
do anything except for the fact that this person actually was dealing with some huge issues, metabolic issues. And we never addressed the overall dietary changes and lifestyle, right? We were so busy just getting the patients out the door that we miss a lot of things. And that's the particular reason why I got into, holistic functional medicine practice. And after graduating from pharmacy school, I went through A4M to get my fellowship in functional medicine training. Now, it only gives you so much information, and
Right.
you build up from there. It just gave me a great foundation. I was only working with patients dealing with hormone dysfunction and gut. And then after dealing with my own problem, now I got into the biotoxin issues and helping clients that way.
Hmm. For sure. Oh, and you were going to tell us how you found out you had parasites for
Oh,
sure.
so sorry. Yeah. So I was dealing with severe food sensitivity issues and histamine response. So namely, if you have things like helmet, for instance, you can actually have very high levels of mast cell activation going on.
Mhm.
So sometimes in certain clients, when we utilize albendazole, for instance, for the 3 to 7 day protocol, the mast cell end up having to decrease drastically.
How wonderful.
Yeah, followed by utilization of Linium, which is called nitazoxanide. And you can do a 1-2 punch. You may need to do another cycle
Pretty
of it, but
fast.
actually it's fast. And
Yeah.
that just doesn't end there. You do have to address mold because parasites
Yeah.
harbor mold and Lyme.
Yeah.
So when you're dealing with mold toxins, for instance, you have to get the underlying colonization of the mold first, then do a parasite tackling, then go after the other co-infections. That's basically
Yeah.
the hierarchy you have to go through instead of actually, which I don't particularly agree with. Some of the practitioners have happened to just utilize parasite protocol right off the bat. Some clients cannot tolerate that right after because you're dealing with colonizing mold. You have an immune system that's already been causing imbalances, and also the gut function that you have to address the overall inflammation first. And this is the reason why adding in the phospholipid therapy from the get-go, it makes so much sense.
For sure. Did you decide in your journey where you were exposed to mold? I think that can be a loaded question, but did you decide,
No,
yes,
I
this
know
is where
exactly where I got it from.
yeah, where did you get it from?
My parents' house.
Oh, yeah. Cool. Did they do
My
anything about it?
Nope, they're still living in a moldy environment. And and especially when I go to the house, I could see mold all over the ceiling. And I know exactly what type of mold it is. And it's hard to discuss that with an Asian immigrant family and how that is impacted. And my parents it's really sad to discuss this, but they're the type of people that if you don't know, it's better.
Right.
So it's hard discussion to make. And anytime I go to a house, I get allergy symptoms. And so I have to do some detox work afterwards. But yeah, it's hard to discuss.
I get that question sometimes from clients who say, what am I going to do when I go to my parents' moldy house? And I was like, here's some ideas. I also have that problem when I go to my parents' house. So you just give yourself some support, stay out of the certain affected areas if you can, and you minimize your exposure as much as possible, I guess.
Yeah. And
In a
then,
nutshell.
and then the basement of my parents' house, we had, I think when I was living there, at least 3 flooding that we actually had. Was
super common.
They're super common. And that was never treated properly.
I remember something flooded in the original house I grew up in until age 10, so this was a distant memory. It just came up to me like not very long ago. And I remember it was so fun because I was probably like 6 years old and we got to stay in a hotel for a week. It was a blast, right? And you think about it, and there's so much poorly done flood exposure, unfortunately. And I talk about this pretty freely at this point because it's so flippin' common. I'm just like, you're just better off if you're aware because you don't have to be like scared. It can be anywhere. And so you're better off if you know, so you can just address it and move on. because none of us are immune to being exposed at any time whatsoever. So I just talk about it. I'm sure that before I became much more aware of how much mold was impacting us, we were just like, oh, it's just fungus that won't go away. Like I think we were really in functional medicine, really into fungal stuff, like maybe 15 years ago. And I think it probably could have just been mold the whole time. Who knows? But
yeah, that's correct. And then another thing that could be an issue, I mean, this can be an impact for people who grew up in a moldy house, they clear the mold issue that they're dealing with. And then the next step they go through is trauma response to deal with the biotoxins, right? They're like, oh my God, a clean environment, everything has to be clean, everything has to be, there's only so much you could do. Right? And then I always mention is that you need to do maintenance work to support your cell membrane, support your detox pathway. So, because you're not going to be living in a perfect environment ever.
Yeah, I agree. Totally agree. I think you can always support yourself with nervous system, adrenal support, and drainage detox support, to emphasize what you said.
Yep.
Dr. John Kim, where can people find you online?
Absolutely. You can find me on Instagram, dr.john.pharmd. I'm always active there. And as well as I have a website, drkimwellness.com. And if you want to do a consult, there's a link there for you to make an appointment and then discuss about the further issues that you might be dealing with.
Cool. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Sharing and reviewing this podcast is the best way to help us succeed with our mission to help integrate the best of East and West and empower you to raise the bar on your health story. Just go to reviewthispodcast.com/less stressed life. That's reviewthispodcast.com/less stressed life. And you'll be taken directly to a page where you can insert your review and hit post.